of women. There's a problem of the representation of women in the global south that we've talked about. So we're critiquing often the representation of women's oppression in parts outside of rich countries. But we're also trying to figure out goals. So the reconstruction part is, how do we define what liberation would look like? What are we aiming toward? And for this, both Sagato and Cotter are arguing for pluralist feminism. So that's what I want to get to today, is what does that mean and how do we think about pluralist feminism with a normative bite to it. I'll give you an example of the representational problem here that's not in the reading, but it's from Uma Narayan, who's an important decolonial, one of the first writing in English. Uma Narayan, who grew up in India, came to the United States to get her PhD in philosophy, fell in love with a white guy. So she stayed in the US. She's teaching still at Vassar College. And wrote some really important work in the 90s, a book called Dislocating Culture that both Serene and I use a lot. And she's looking at what today we talk about as femicide, right? So she's looking at violence against women. So in the 1990s, I don't know, some of you weren't born in the 1990s, but in the 1990s, there was a lot of coverage in the global press of violence against women in India. Two particular forms got a lot of coverage. One was dowry murders, what was called dowry murders, and the other was sati. So sati, S-A-T-I, is usually spelled in English, is a form of self-immolation or suicide that's represented as being traditional in Hindu communities, in which the female widow whose husband dies, so she's widowed, killed herself in a spectacular, painful fashion, in a kind of ritualized fashion, right? So that's sati. Dowry murders were murders that were happening a lot in India in the 1990s. And that's when you murder your first wife, or perhaps your parents murder your first wife so that you can marry again and get a second dowry, right? Because dowries are always part of the marriage ceremony. So both of these forms of violence that we're getting a lot of coverage in the global press are obviously represented in a way that's specific to Hindu societies, right? So it wasn't just murders of women, it was dowry murders. That was the discussion. It wasn't just violence against women, it was sati and dowry murders. So both of these forms of violence associated what was happening to a culture, right? So you could see this form of violence as caused by a culture. The truth is, of course, that sati had been almost non-existent until the modern period. It had gone out of practice, and then it had reemerged in practice, and there's some wonderful feminist Indian historians who can tell you the history of sati. So it was not continuous, it was not unbroken, and its reemergence had to do with a rejection of British culture that was being imposed. So it's a complicated story of sati. But what Uma Narayan did, she's going to dinner parties in the United States with faculty members. And they're saying to her, what do you think about this, right? And she's feeling really, like she can't even have a conversation at the dinner table about this with these people. So she decides to do some thinking and do some writing on it. So she looks up the statistics of violence against women in India in the 1990s, and then she decides, let me look up the statistics of violence against women in the United States and compare. So she tries to find the statistics in the United States of wife murder, category of wife murder. Today we would call it intimate partner violence, to be more broad, but it's the same thing. And she can't find those statistics because the United States is not keeping those statistics. They don't have a category of wife murder. At the time, they didn't have a category of intimate partner violence in that way. And intimate partner is also a little problematic because it's not specified to particular gender or genders. But she can't find the statistics, but she finally does. She figures out a way to research it and to look at various organizations that are keeping track. And she finds that the truth is there's about equal numbers in both countries of murders of intimate partners, of wives, in the United States and in India. So Hindu culture is not the cause of this. We need to think beyond. And the other thing she finds and argues is that the method of murder is different. So in India and other parts of the world, dowry murders were often inflicted by burning a woman in the kitchen, throwing oil on her and then lighting it. So it would be these horrific fires. Whereas in the United States, how does it happen? With guns. But in India, it's represented as caused by some cultural concepts and practices that are age-old. That's the assumption made. And in the United States, culture does not play a role in the explanations given of violence against women. Culture has nothing to do with it. The fact that we have this mass gun culture in the United States has nothing to do with the murders of women. It's just individual misogynists who get out of control and murder women. So it's not seen as a social problem that needs analysis in the same way. So what Narayan argues is that the dowry murders that are happening with fire is based on what's available. In many parts of the world, in kitchens, you have a can of oil. It's readily available, it's right there. And so it serves the purpose. And in many US homes, you have a gun. It's right there. So the difference between the two begin to recede. Both involve, we need cultural analysis, perhaps, and we need political analysis, and we need feminist analysis, and a combination of all three things and others as well to understand this violence against women. It's not that we need a cultural analysis only over there, and over here we don't need a cultural analysis. So that's the problem of representation, and it has not changed that much today, right? It has not changed that much today. So how do we then reconstruct a different analysis for these spaces? Yesterday, we talked about Rita Segato, and I found this passage I had been looking for yesterday, where she describes the village world and the way in which the village world operates with participation, with democratic participation of a sort. She gives us two examples here. One is the example in the Amazonian and Chaqueño peoples who restrict women's participation in speech in their village's public space. But when the assembly comes together to make decisions, they have to consult what is called the woman's world. So there has to be a consultation. And if the consultation does not take place, men are harshly penalized. So there is a participation in the village world in this mechanism for many of the Amazonian peoples. In the Andean world, the Andean indigenous world, it operates a little differently. She says the sort of leadership, Malku, is always dual. There's always a female and a male leader of the community. All community deliberations are attended by women. The women either sit next to their male companions or their spouses, or sometimes their spouses, sometimes not their spouses. Or sometimes the women form a group outside the room, and they send audible signals of approval or disapproval throughout the course of the debate. So inside, the people may be debating, and outside, the group of women are expressing their reactions to that debate. So the public space and its actors, the public space meaning the space inside the assembly room, they do not have a monopoly on politics or political expression as in the colonial modern world. So we can, so we have to, like, how do we figure out how we think about these kinds of systems? It's different from the colonial modern world, but in the colonial modern world, we often simply vote once every 4 years and then go on about our business. So there isn't this kind of group organized participation in political decision making. So you can begin to see there's pluses and minuses to different systems, rather than just there being one model that is the correct model that others must follow. So with that, let me, we'll turn to Serene Cotter, because she wants to, ask, what should our judgment be? That's the issue of normativity. Normativity is a word philosophers use for judging, for deciding what the norms of practice should be. And she's criticizing Enlightenment liberalism and missionary feminism in this book. And so she has an account of what Enlightenment liberalism or Enlightenment conceptions of freedom are in this book. So half the book is really critique, and the other half is trying to move us toward reconstruction in the sense of judging in a different way. Here she says, Enlightenment liberalism is a view according to which moral progress occurs through the abandonment of traditional values and unchosen relationships, leaving your culture behind, leaving your traditions behind, as well as through the universalization of economic independence. So this is sort of the core idea. So feminism requires a transcendence or a moving away from cultural traditions. That's key. We also know, of course, that the concept of the European Enlightenment, the practice of the European Enlightenment, had economic motivations, right? It was a disruption of social connections and social institutions to reorganize economic production, turn people from landowners into wage workers, wage slaves in Marx's term, and break down the institutions that might organize resistance. This is what Fanon writes about in his important 1956 speech that he made in Paris, when he talks about the destruction of cultures. And he says, it's not that the colonists really care about these cultures. What they care about is resistance. And this is what destroying, as you were talking about yesterday in terms of genocide, one of the social conditions, the cultural conditions that destroys the possibility of resistance. So it's cloaked as modern enlightenment. It's cloaked in many cases as we're helping to bring them into the 20th century or the 17th century back in the day. But but a prime motivation, Fanon argues, many people have shown, Emil Cabral also writes about this, is the destruction of lines of resistance, of sources of resistance. And there is an economic motivation. So it's the abandonment of traditional values. So when you see a woman who is still religious, who is still operating within their culture, they're going to be seen necessarily as less free, right? Less free, less autonomous, less agential, with less agency on the Enlightenment liberal view. And the universalization of economic independence. What this means is that every individual has to be economically independent, not the family unit or the cultural group or a particular group, but every individual has to be economically independent. Now, this was advice my mother gave me, right? Be able to support yourself and your children on your own. And she gave me that advice because she had some rough experiences as a young woman, and she had to get out of, and she needed that economic independence to be able to do it. So she was schooling me and my sisters on this. So it comes out of protection and survival and not wanting to be vulnerable. So we understand those reasons and that argument. But we want to think, let's try to think outside the box and think outside of the idea of individual economic independence. So missionary feminism is the term that she uses in this book to describe a view that I think we're familiar with, the idea of that feminism started in Western societies, which it did not, and then moves to the rest of the world. A kind of representation that many feminist NGOs still operate with today and still use today to get funds from private sources. We're going to bring feminism to the world, and that assumes it's not there already. That assumes there's nothing to learn for feminists from these other spaces. So from the West to the rest, the diffusion theory that major human inventions began in one location, the idea that Europe invented science and art and political institutions of democracy and political institutions of democratic participation, all false claims, which excellent historians are now really abolishing the basis of these kinds of claims. Used to be it was only kind of fringe historians that would work on these topics. Now it's like the major historians who are in high status institutions who are doing this work and sharing, look, there's just no evidence for this. The evidence does not support this. Missionary feminism also assumes that its form of feminism can be applied everywhere. And it doesn't understand its own agenda as located and partial. And this is a methodological point, right? So we need to understand our analyses always as coming from a particular location with our available concepts, our available experiences, our available historical archives and historical knowledge. And thus partial, right? So there's a partiality. And this is why I was arguing in that earlier paper that theory can be harder to decolonize than the social sciences, because theory wants to develop concepts that work for everywhere, that are applied everywhere. And this is what missionary feminism did. So if you have this point of view, you don't need to take local women's views into account. You can launch a campaign against genital cutting, for example, from the outside as some criticized Alice Walker for doing in the film that she made on it, that didn't have any local women activists in the film who had successfully transformed and eradicated practices of genital cutting in their own communities. But you don't need to go to those women or get their point of view when you've got the analysis and you've got the universal project. Teach and preach without dialogue or coalition. So you don't need to develop the cross-cultural communication skills. You don't need to develop dialogic epistemologies or political coalitions from the point of view of missionary feminism. I mean, missionary feminism makes it sound like it's really old, but of course it's not gone yet. It's still with us. And some of the people who enact it are well-meaning, but it's methodologically a problem. It's not about intention. I don't care about intention. I don't even care about ethical responsibility. I'm an epistemologist. Serene is much better on the ethics part, so go to her for the ethics arguments. I want to know what's happening and who has the power to participate and whose power has been silenced or curtailed. So I want to know what the effects are. So this, as I say, this approach controls a lot of resources. I don't know if people know about the cook stove problem that Hillary Clinton, some of you do. She put a lot of money into providing cook stoves, because a lot of people use cook stoves in different parts of Africa. And she touted this as a sign and a symbol that she was being a global feminist. The cook stoves, they did not consult women who actually use the cook stoves, what the local conditions are. So when they were provided, turns out they caused a lot of fires inside the home, releasing gas and deteriorating health. So it could have been avoided with a dialogic, consultative recognition that there is knowledge on the other side and not just knowledge on the side of the West. Okay, so enlightenment freedom, this is where Serene gets into some concepts and concept change for us. I mean, enlightenment freedom is usually represented just as freedom, right? What is freedom? To be free is to be free from following tradition or social conventions. So to the extent you operate within a tradition or social conventions, you are necessarily less free. And you may, authentically choose to be necessarily less free, and some missionary feminists will accept that. But you are less free if you are working within a tradition, religious tradition or cultural tradition. So enlightenment freedom is often negative freedom. It's freedom from. It's defined as what you are free from and not what you're free to do, right? Not a positive sense of freedom. You can have a massive amount of freedom from, but not have very much freedom to. But that kind of falls off the map of analysis, right? So a lot of libertarianism today. I know there's right-wing libertarianism, and I know there's this thing called left-wing libertarianism. I don't really believe in it, but there is a thing called left-wing libertarianism. But that's generally the way in which they define freedom is as my right to buy a gun, my right to buy an assault rifle, my right to buy an unlimited supply of equipment for that assault rifle, bullets for that assault rifle, right? Then I'm free. And if I can't do that, I am not free. if the government is restricting my rights in that way, then I am not free. So it's very compatible with capitalism, right? Enlightenment freedom is very compatible with capitalism, because you have the right to purchase whatever you want to that's available on the market, and they will make every noxious, horrible thing available to you on the market. And if that is restricted, you have less freedom. If what you can purchase in the market is restricted, you have less freedom. This is what's going on in the public culture in the United States today. The other concept that she gives us that's very useful is a distinction between two kinds of individualism: independence individualism and personhood individualism. So she argues for personhood individualism, but is critical of independence and individualism. Independence individualism is sort of a form of negative freedom. So the individual is independent. You can choose your relationships. You can choose what duties and obligations you have, right? You are an independent individual. So if I choose to take care of my mother, who's very ill right now, it's my choice, right? I'm an independent individual, my choice. I don't have those duties because she changed my diapers, right? It's not part of me. It's a choice that I have. That's independence individualism. And a lot of liberal feminism promotes this. And there's reasons that they promote it, right? They don't want women, particularly women, often who are assumed to have to play these roles of care, to do this care work, to sacrifice other goals, projects that they have to do the care work in the family. Unpaid care work, sometimes very, very difficult care work. So independence individualism has a logic to it. It's intuitive. And I teach at City University of New York. And I have a room full of immigrant women, mostly women, and some guys and others. And the immigrant women are concerned about this because often some of them are really fighting their families to go to college, to pursue a career, to have different things. So I'm having them read Serene Cotter and they're saying, oh, wow. But then sometimes, they think through it. But there's a logic to it, and it's important in the ideas that we contest to be as thorough as possible about what are those ideas? Why are they so powerful? Why are they so persuasive? Are there parts that we can agree with? Are there parts that we don't agree with? And do a fair and thorough assessment. But after doing that, Serene argues it's a problem because we don't choose our relationships, right? We are bound, we are connected emotionally, economically, materially, culturally, religiously. We are collective. We are part of collectives. That's what makes us as individuals possible, right? That's what makes it possible for us to have the wherewithal to make our own choices, is because we are connected to others. And those connections sometimes make it possible for us to have more autonomy than we would have otherwise, right? I can leave a bad first marriage, which I was really struggling with, my first marriage, and I kept... I'm his first marriage. Yeah. But I used to kick myself because I kept leaving my husband and then I would go back. I kept leaving him, I would go back until I met Larry. And then I left him and I didn't go back. And I kicked myself because I thought, Linda, what's wrong with you? Why can't you just leave your husband on your own? Why did it take, falling in love with somebody else? But it took me years to get through that thought. process of beating myself up for this. He gave me the strength. He gave me the emotional support. He gave me an image of myself that was different than what I had previously. And so sometimes, it's relations that make it possible for us to be autonomous in our lives, right? It is our relations that make it possible for us to achieve a full humanity and a full subjectivity. So relations are not always a drag on our freedom or on our autonomy. They can be a support. And so personhood individualism is what Serene is using to talk about what it means to be a person. To be a person is not just to be unconnected from others. To be a person is to be someone who has the ability to participate in the decision-making that is important for their lives, right? Maybe not all decision-making, but the decision-making that is important for their lives. So if you're in a marriage where you have a division of labor and it's based on gender, and the women have the right to make decisions about certain things, like how to dress the children, and the men have the right to decide where you're going to live or what religion you're going to follow or what kind of practices you're going to follow, then you don't have full personhood, right? You don't have full personhood individualism. So she thinks the gender-based division of labor may not be a problem in all cases. It depends on what's in each category of decisions that are being made. This is what she's going to argue. So she's going to look, so she says we should look, when we see gender-based divisions of labor, are the women persons in their role, in their sphere? Are they able to achieve personhood? So she argues against gender role eliminativism and gender eliminativism and certain formulations of it. She argues that the liberal feminist, the Enlightenment feminist idea that we have to eliminate gender roles, understand ourselves always as individuals, and that is the only route to women's liberation. That's the only way to have fairness or freedom for women, is false. That there may be a variety. This is the pluralism part, right? So there may be, this is not the model for all that we must follow, right? But there may be plural forms of the good life, plural forms of good communities with democratic participation of all genders, that manifest personhood individualism and manifest positive political values. So we can still judge and compare, but we can see there are plural roads. So that's her argument. Her argument is not that we're not going to judge gender-based divisions of labor. We can still judge them. So that's why she wants to come up with some general or generic or universals. We need to move away from freedom as individual autonomy and think about group freedom. We need to move away from secularism as necessarily more rational way to live than non-secularism. Secularism today is, you may know, comes in many different forms. There's a lot of different scholarship on the form of secularism that is assumed in many parts of the West is a Protestant form of secularism. It's not really a generic secularism. It's about me and my relationship to my God. That's Protestantism. That's not Catholicism, right? With Catholic, you go through the priest. But Protestantism, it's me in relationship with my God. So that's a particular form of secularism, and it's been represented as more rational because it involves the individual, right? It involves the individual reflecting on themselves and interacting. So in Iran, I had a former student, Ali Reza Shomali, who has written on this, and other Iranian theorists have written on this, that there's actually a desire for a form of secularism in Iran by many people, but it's not the form of secularism that would be legible in the West as secularism. So they want the public space to be Muslim, right? So you still have a public space which is Muslim, but you have some ability for variation in how you manifest that and how you perform your religious ideas, which is similar to the way in which many countries have Christianity. We do not have secularism in the United States, really. It's just like, you know, it's not just now, it's always been. Our holidays, our school holidays, the calendar, everything is organized around Christianity and Sunday, 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 not Saturday, not Friday night. So we don't really have secularism either. So this is sort of what some Iranian intellectuals that I've read and talked to want. They want a public space that's not devoid of most people's practices, that enables most people's practices, but that doesn't mandate a narrow view of what those practices require. So there's an ongoing debate today among political philosophers about forms of secularism, right? Different forms of it that are different from the Enlightenment sort of model. The other concept that Serene gives us is justice monism, which is the idea that there is one form of justice that is going to be applied everywhere. So we need to move away from justice monism and have a pluralist idea of justice. We'll see. And we need to question the assumption that we want gender-neutral public spheres. Does a public sphere need to be gender-neutral for there to be liberation for all genders? Or can the public sphere have separate spaces? Can some religious institutions have gender-specific spaces and still there be personhood individualism, there be participation, there be interpretation that is respected, there be the capacity for critical thinking and participation. So it may be the case that when we have gender-neutral public spheres, in the Andean and in the Amazonian examples, the Amazonian, remember, where deliberation is, the deliberators have to consult the women's world. They have to go outside of the assembly space and consult the women's world. And if they don't do that, the decisions are not valid. And in the Andean space, where you have community deliberations that involve both men and women, but there's a group outside the room that is sending audible signals of their view of what's going on inside the room. Those are spaces that are organized by group identity, right? These are not spaces of individuals who each have the same role as in the Western model. These are models that involve group identity. And it's hard sometimes for Western feminists to get their head around this idea, because group identity seems to be curtailing the possibility of individual expression or individuality. But Serene is suggesting, let's think about this in a complicated way. Let's think about the possibilities that in some cases such examples may allow for expressions of group interests and group needs and group judgment and have a more powerful effect than the individual voting. business. So it's going to be complicated. There may be pluses and minuses to different systems, right? But it's not the case that these systems are completely behind us. And so she's also questioning the concept of neutrality, treating everyone as the same. This is an ongoing debate in feminist ethics and feminist theory. Treating everyone the same means treating everyone as if nobody has menstrual cramps that really debilitate them for a couple of days or more a month, as some female bodies do. So you treat everyone the same. You have work rules of coming in. It doesn't matter, and this kind of thing cannot be raised. Japan does. Japan, you get days off for menstruation. Do you know that? Pretty interesting when I found that out.
Also, the U.S. historically in healthcare, which was predominantly female women workers for many, many years, it's changed now, industrialization and stuff. Women, there was always 12 sick days a year, 1 per month, to correspond to the menstrual cycle. This is historic, how it happened in all healthcare settings. I don't know if you
in the past.
It's leaving. I didn't really
Yeah. So that's what it means to, really think about group identity in some cases, which will enhance the possibility of people retaining their jobs. Because some jobs, you have 2 absences and you get written up, right? So you actually put your job in jeopardy. And sometimes the body decides for us whether or not we can go in on a particular day or not. So neutrality, treating everyone the same, does not reach to justice. It does not achieve the end point of justice in all cases. So we have to rethink that. She also takes up the other theme that I'm doing for the week, which is the underestimated agency. Her first book was on adaptive preferences of women in the global South. And she was looking at the ways in which women's decision-making in the global South was being judged. Why do they choose to stay in this family when it's oppressive to them? What is wrong with them? This kind of thing. She was looking particularly in Central America, actually, for many of her examples. And this is a term used by some philosophers, adaptive preferences. So they're your preferences, but they're preferences that are adaptive within a particular situation. So they're the best preferences you got within a particular situation. So adaptive preferences is a big concept, and there's a lot of analysis among philosophers who work in ethics on it. And she wanted to look at the rationality of some adaptive preferences that were being judged as forms of internalized oppression, right? Sometimes it is internalized oppression, but sometimes it is adapting with agency, not without agency, but with agency to a given situation in which you're living. It's a very good book. Religious Practice, I already talked about the first day, from Ada Maria Asazi Diaz, and examples of cultural transmission, which involve communal transformations. Often we see women who participate in teaching the traditions of a particular cultural religion as simply repetition, simply following, rather than interpreting, adapting, thinking about how they want to do it, maybe slightly differently. in individual situations. So that's examples of underestimated agency and also identity construction that Maria Asazi Diaz gives us. And I talked about Shelby. So if we can overcome the problem of underestimated agency, this will help us develop a methodology of liberatory praxis, not only across dialogue, but for ourselves and the way we understand ourselves, the way I re-understood myself after marrying this guy. So I have more epistemic self-confidence, right? This is really important, especially for females, I think, is to have more epistemic self-authorization and confidence in our own judgment. Being open to discussion, but more. So what Serene argues, she gives us these new concepts. She argues that we can look at gender-based divisions of labor, and we can judge negatively those that have what she calls headship complementarianism. Headship complementarianism, she thinks, is the problem, not the gender-based division of labor in and of itself. The gender-based division of labor may be okay, may not be okay. If it has headship complementarianism, that's a problem, because that means one side is the head and the other side's not the head. So the important decisions, where you're going to live, how you're going to live, are made by one side, by the male side. So that's a problem. It's not gender roles or complementary roles per se. And the other thing that she's arguing here is when we do this judging, when we look at different systems, we need to think about it in a time frame rather than as static. So we need to think about ameliorative goals. What may enhance justice? What may lead to transformations rather than ideals that are absolutes or outside of context? She applies this to covering. Huge debate, and we're gonna, we can talk about Alia Al-Saji's piece on this tomorrow, but here Serene is looking at different types of covering. So some people have to stay inside the home. Some people can cover fully and go outside the home. Some people can cover partially and go outside the home. And Serene argues that we can think about justice enhancement in the sense of some covering that allows you to go outside the home, see your friends, see your family, connect with community members, is important. If you have to cover in order to do that, that's a positive thing, right? The covering makes it possible for you to maintain important relationships and maybe also have a job, have a paid job outside the home. So we need to think about what are the options here and what are the pluses and minuses to each option, rather than thinking about some decontextualized, absolute, perfect form of self-presentation in some nirvana utopia that is then mandated for all, right? So she thinks, you know, what we want to look for when we look at different gender arrangements and different gender practices is we want to think, what might be enhancing justice in this context, in my context, right? What may be enhancing justice in my context? What may be maybe a step toward further change, right? So there may be further change down the road if I take this step rather than that step. And this is non-ideal theory. This is the idea of doing gender analysis, feminist analysis in the real world, in the non-ideal world, rather than ideal theory. And And the result is pluralist approaches to buen vivir, or a good life. So she thinks we need some universals. All women deserve health care, education, the ability to participate meaningfully in the democratic life of their communities. These are the kinds of things that she wants to say are universals, but she wants to decolonize these universals so that we end up with pluralism in the way that they might be manifest, pluralism and forms of life. So that's it on Serene Cotter. So it's can be hard to get your head around this concept of pluralism, but I think she's right that we need to have a pluralism about the good life, that there can be multiple forms of the good life. But I think she's also right that we need to still be able to judge and not be culturally relative. So she's trying to develop an alternative to cultural relativism, which is simply, I can't judge you, do what you want. I will just stay in my box. And in the global world, with social media, it's really hard to stay in the box because there is communication, there's influence beyond. It's not really realistic. We're not siloed anymore in the way that we were, because we have this larger public culture and we have our own public culture in different contexts. But we need to have a more pluralist approach to feminism than existed in Enlightenment freedom notions or missionary feminism or most Western feminism even today. Let me stop there and then open it up for your thoughts and your discussion on these points. Yes.
So something that struck me in your talk was this, when you started talking about the period. Mm-hmm. I think the reason that this struck me was because the way we're talking about feminism is very gendered, binary. Mm-hmm. And I have a period, but don't call me a woman, right?
Right.
And I have many, many colleagues and friends who should be called a woman who don't get periods, right? So this is also very colonial in the ways we're talking about feminism. There's so much indigenous history and Eastern history of a multiple gender experience that the colonial era washed away, right? So we know this in our histories, that homosexuality and multiple genders was part of our experience that Europe took from our cultures, right? And so now we're in a dual gender that we fit, am I a man or am I a woman? Yeah. Feminism for women, we're talking about women's rights. We should be talking about femininity and masculinity as energies, not as fixed sets of who we are, because it really is that we're reinforcing colonialism, discussion of decolonial feminism by not recognizing how colonialism redefined gender in these very, I think, violent ways that so many of us are now trying to redefine.
Yeah.
And it's still coming up against this very fixed feminism that, for me, doesn't fit, and I think for many other people, it's problematic.
Well, I agree with this analysis. I mean, to a large point, I think certainly the variety of genders that and still exists in some places, like in India today, recognized, and many indigenous communities that are recognized today with particular roles and particular identities. Sometimes we might criticize the way in which they are represented, but the idea that there's more than two is ubiquitous throughout history and throughout cultures. And so the West is way behind on this. In terms of periods, I do think periods are important, but that doesn't mean we have to associate it only with a woman group, by that term. You could bargain a contract which has stipulations of a recognition that periods exist and can be a problem. So you can devise a group of people who have periods. I don't have a period anymore, so I'm not in that group because I'm too old, right? So it's not everybody with a female appearing body who's going to be a person who's in the category of people who have periods that need work rules that will make it possible for them to continue their work. So we need to have, flexibility in the way in which we define these group categories. I mean, periods are interesting, because, oh my God, the first time I started teaching and I was giving some example and I talked about a period and it was like in a male majority philosophy classroom, this guy went, oh, it's like you said the word. It's like it's still, in the history of the West, it's like this menstrual blood. There's all these histories of things about menstrual blood, and that this is part of the reason why women have to be sequestered and why they can't be touched because they might be menstruating, and that's this. So there's a very interesting sort of cultural ideas about menstruation and menstrual blood that is part of the cultural misogyny,
If I can add to what you're saying, so I remember attending this workshop in Delhi, which was organized by the Gynecological Association of Delhi. So these doctors came to spread awareness about menstruation and specifically what young girls go through. So they also discussed this concept of feeding leave. So to begin with, they also try to dispel these myths around purity and pollution related to menstruation, and they said that during the past years where there were no sanitary products as such, that would enhance your mobility as they do right now. So those were very practical reasons why women were asked to stay inside inside one particular zone in the house so that the blood does not drip around and of course. So and they were not allowed to go into the kitchen because then it gets cooking.
Even though menstrual blood is very clean, right? It's actually very clean. But
yeah, no, but then it's very practical. They just said that this was very practical of those times when they, because it could be an issue cleaning around and this and that, whatever, right? I don't know actually. So then they also mentioned this one particular thing that, that it actually depends when you start arguing for period leave because, so if you experience a lot of pain, that's not normal. If and then if we normalize the concept of period leave, then it pushes you inside your home. You start thinking that it's normal. I deserve my rest for these 2 days, and this might discourage young girls from coming out and expressing this to their families and or going to a gynecologist saying that I'm experiencing pain because at many of these times this could be a symptom of endometriosis, which doesn't go it is not diagnosed on time because they think that it's normal. And I remember growing up in my family with a lot of pain around my periods, and I would be told by my mother, oh, it's normal, and eventually I was diagnosed with endometriosis. This is something which one needs to be also, and my perspective on this is that women have fought so much back in India to contest these dogmatic ideas about you stay inside one room, you don't touch you don't touch whatever like things in the kitchen, and don't enter the kitchen, and don't do this, don't do that. So if we start claiming that we need period leave, then it will aggravate those discriminations. It will regenerate them. They will be channelized from different areas, even in workplaces. Because in workplaces, when we discuss these things, there is still a very, very resounding silence. Men do not want to engage with you when you start talking about your.
Yeah, it still has a stigma, or also the stigma that, well, you're not going to be able to work as hard as me, so therefore you shouldn't be paid the same as me, right? So as we move away from neutrality and independence, individualism, and we're trying to move into a sphere in which we have more recognition of diversity of experience and needs, we can do it in good ways and in bad ways, right? There's debate over how to do this, when we move from neutrality to this other space. There's going to be debate, and in some cases we have to do it before we see what all the downsides are. Did you want to get?
Thinking about also another thing that exactly in some places it might be detrimental to this kind of, yes, the training is not so
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time in the West, it's the opposite because it's about, we don't talk about it, it doesn't exist. So it would be different. Yeah, in different places, which is about this neutrality. Yeah. That was also the an argument that I think, I don't know if it's missing or not, but in my head is that decolonize the universals, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is a big point, underlying thing that is recognizing that the West has it. This is for all arguments, and that's the basis. It's usually this neutrality, it belongs to the West. We were all American, US centric, that but yet we can study other cultures. So we can be objective of others, and that's also at the beginning when you were mentioning, and I think that is always a bit of a missing argument when about decolonizing universals, because it is the point that it's not only bringing some things neutral outside of this universal, but it's about recognizing that and it exists. So then we can have a discussion, because otherwise it's about us, we are neutral, we are objective, and we can judge, decide whatever, but
Right.
and into the sentence that you said about being free from following tradition of social social conventions, that is exactly what the West is. But all the Western feminism is doing, it's about being right to those social conventions that are hard to do. It's not recognized.
Yeah.
So that is, yeah, I think it's going one step back or behind
Yeah, this is what I think a lot of feminist theorists are trying to bring out is it is culture to culture, right? That's why we need the communicative and the dialogic processes. It's not neutrality to culture. It's not objectivity in that old sense to culture. People in feminist philosophy of science are redefining objectivity to mean something like multiple points of view, rather than one point of view that is absolute. So strong objectivity, as Sandra Harding defined it, involved the presence of multiple points of view in a particular empirical project of analysis, rather than the idea that you have no point of view. And the theories of rationality that I follow, there's traditions in the hermeneutic tradition, which is that we all carry with us a horizon of meanings, as they put it, available concepts, available ideas and concepts that we find intelligible, that we find useful. And so what rationality is it's not judging from nothingness to, it is judging from a particular hermeneutic horizon, and within that hermeneutic horizon still judging which are better and worse ways to move forward. So we all have this hermeneutic horizon, and when you're not aware that you have it, that's when you can really get into trouble in terms of misjudging others as well. But the horizon idea I like because it's moving, right? My horizon is moving with me. It's not fixed. It moves through my life. now for me, period is not the issue. Menopause. Menopause is just ignored in our societies, and we're supposed to go on about our business and work at the same pace. It's like insane. And this is dangerous because, I mean, I have also been criticized by colleagues for, I couldn't possibly have earned this award that I got because my colleague was a single man without children, and he could work 7 days a week, and I had these kids, these rotten kids. So the assumption, he argued this in the newspaper. He made this claim in the newspaper. So the idea that females just are never going to be equal in scientific contributions and intellectual contributions and political contributions because our body drags us down, some of us, is something that needs to be overcome because these experiences inform us. It is part of our hermeneutic horizon. All of our various kinds of physical experiences that we have inform us and inform our political analysis and our ethical analysis. So these are not just things that drag us down. These are also things that provide us insight and information. Yes.
More like one thing there is, but it's autism. I wonder, is it that, I mean, if it's to left ideas that are always like centuries, there were ideas that there is a hierarchy versus other nations. And I understand also if who get inspiration that maybe can look at how people do now in India, in Africa, and then maybe you will get inspired to take something from them to implement in the US or in France. That makes sense to me. But one question I have is I don't fully understand why you would need to judge how other people do because it's almost like they are in a bad situation but they can't see it. And I believe that at some point, if we can go outside and compare and then see that situation in Europe or in the US or even sometimes we don't need to look outside because we feel that it's not good. Why? Where is the balance between providing inspiration to others and also thinking that they won't realize that situation is shit or it's dangerous or it's harmful? Like, I don't really understand that.
Yeah, that's another good question. I think the motivating force here is the presence of transnational feminist coalition that exists. There's transnational feminist organizational cooperation. Sometimes there's transnational feminist activism against femicide, for example. And so how do we do this, right? How do we do this? Do we make collaboration or coalitions with everybody who calls themselves feminists, or do we need to like make some distinctions? It's a complicated story. So I think in those conditions, in many conditions, you can hold back. I mean, you don't need to like make an analysis, although you may be thinking in your head. But even if you're just thinking inside your head, Serene Cotter wants us to be careful, right? About thinking, even if we're not enacting our judgment on somebody or in some way, if we're thinking inside our head, we need to think about how we're thinking inside our head. What are the concepts that we're using to do that? And in transnational feminist activism, which sometimes happens without collaboration. And so she's arguing, against that. And I like what you're saying about getting inspiration. I mean, we have to, in the West, we have to undo Enlightenment feminism, missionary feminism, to even be open to being inspired by different ways of being, and different ways of family formation, different ways of life. So we have to get rid of some of these ideas of neutrality, objectivity, and absolutes to become open to new possibilities that we get from others. Kelly.
To respond to that, and what comes to mind is situations of predatory work, for example. So at least in the sphere of healthcare, for instance, Filipinos go to other cultures, and so if you don't dismantle other forms of gender hierarchy just because of the cultural norms, I think it would be quite problematic in those situations. So we move most helpful and we have these multi-layers of evolution. Because a lot of these kinds of work are invisibilized, and it's not as if it's just one culture judging another culture, vice versa. But bodies move around in order to reproduce the society. And so I think it is important to have those transnational conversations, and how to move when you move into things. But I also did not want the invitation earlier to refrain from using women in terms of questioning and straighting bodies.
Mm-hmm.
That's a category that we can use. But the question I had for the discussion was, when we talk about what enhances justice for now, given the choices that we have, that we're never being complacent about those things, but what theoretical realities that really rather give us, stop us from being complacent and just settling for what is good for us.
So yeah, the idea of enhancement. So the idea of being able to cover and going outside, and then being able to do political organizing and communication and just, sharing of ideas and developing resistance makes it possible. So it's the idea of justice enhancement is not just the idea of this is better than that. It's the idea of this may lead to more things. Right, so it's a vector. It's like Sagato talks about, but it's the idea of let's think about what might lead to more changes, as well as what it might be better than what exists there. So that's a different way to analyze it. Let me get you and then you. Yeah. Okay. Well, you've spoken before, but go ahead.
My question is really about how the arguments how to contextualize where sort of defending women's rights is being used, at trans identity, communities of work and from that. Our arguments, that is how we get our arguments, try to unpack how that is
Yeah.
how we better sort of find what also in another sort of counter how some identities are used literature. I think we talked a bit about that yesterday.
Yeah.
When we were talking about trans identities.
Right.
these kinds of ideas.
Homo nationalism, is that sort of problem? Yeah, people are talking
And
about.
the other thing about the terminology, we were trying to sort of get how best we can do this, but also don't not pathologize or medicalize it. That might also start with it.
Mhm.
That when we identify, treatment by organ systems, they're very medical approach to it. So how we use
Yeah,
language without using that medical sort of viewpoint.
yeah,
And obviously the biological viewpoint, but also as well how these technologies are then translated.
yeah,
Then when we translate it, I know that at least in the issue of gender, the moment that we translate an Arabic speaker, I feel that it is
yeah,
or just reinforcing some ideas of
yeah.
so how do we do that in a way that
Many points there, really wonderful points. I mean, I like the work of Eduardo Viveres de Castro. Do you know his work on translation? He argues that translation never succeeds as a perfect representational, move. There's always what he calls equivocation, which means that you're translating some words into another word, but it's not exactly, right? It's not exactly conveying the same connotations, the meanings that are mobilized for us by words because of our shared hermeneutic horizon. In some cases, you translate it, it doesn't happen. So equivocation is inevitable, and it's not a failure. De Castro says it's not a failure. But what it means is that that's another argument against the objective God's eye point of view, because we have to stay in communication with people who have different hermeneutic horizons and different sensibilities, and the words are not going to translate. So you need to stay in dialogue and communication across those differences. And we need to develop skills of work, of theoretical work, of empirical work that recognizes that and makes it possible, rather than looking for the master key, terms that is going to make all those differences disappear. The other thing I would say, two other points. I mean, I think homo nationalism is very interesting. It's been written about for a couple of decades now. The imperialists can use anything. We will always be recuperated. We will always be co-opted. So we always have to be in movement. I think that's a lesson from Adorno and other philosophers that I like. So I don't think we will have a master key, a liberatory key that's going to be final and not going to be able to be twisted and used for purposes of military intervention and imperialism. So we have to stay mobile. It's not about trashing others. It's about recognizing the complexities of the way in which queer liberation can be, transformed and used. When I teach lesbian oppression, I particularly often teach. I use the work of a philosopher named Cheshire Calhoun, who's done some good work to show that she argues that it operates very differently from sexism. Because sexism says women need to be here in this space, they need to have lesser political power, they need to be sequestered over here, and then as long as they're over here, it's okay. Whereas heterosexism says you don't have a right to exist. Right, so it's exclusion. So it's more like the exclusion that Falguni Sheth is theorizing in her paper on Muslim immigrants that we may have time to talk about tomorrow. Potential terrorists, right? So if you're in the category of potential terrorists, as she talks about, you do not deserve constitutional protections. You do not deserve legal rights. You do not have a right to be in this nation. We can ship you off to Guatemala or Guantanamo or Ecuador. So exclusion as a form of oppression is what people are facing today, the trans exclusion. It's not about staying in your place. So it's life and death. It is absolute invisibility in the public sphere. And so we need to, like, rather than thinking that within this domain of feminism, we have all the concepts we need, we can take the oppression of women, people designated women, and then apply it to other groups. We need to recognize that we need to understand there's multiple forms of stigma and multiple forms of interpolation of identities. And just one last point is about, I think one way we can demedicalize these things is to think about lived embodiment. So the body not as an object. I know this is going to come up in the health discussions, but the body not as a reified object, but as a lived embodiment. And, you know, and this is a much better way to think about periods, because period pain is sometimes connected to stress. It's sometimes connected to the context. It's sometimes connected to what our lived experiences are. So we need an understanding of health and of the body that takes into account consciousness and context and social and political conditions, and not just this sort of objectivist conception. Last point.
I really want to respond to, actually,
Yeah.
I was going to bring up the question you asked about what is the trans analysis of this, and certainly I don't have a model, but I'm just going to bring up a couple of ideas. So something that came up last night in discussion I want to raise here is that the trans scholar Paul Preciado in Spanish has written in his book, Countersexual Manifesto, he writes about how under colonialism/capitalism, masculine identity is actually normalized as being you're either a soldier or you're a tool. And so the male body is meant to fit into systems as a piece of the system, to fit into machines. You think about the movie Metropolis, that
Yeah.
figure within the machine, like that kind of thing, right? Or in war, as being a body made for war. And so part of the issue I think that we're talking about period leave, is actually the question of whose bodies conform to the expectation that they can be a tool. Something that I noticed in men, they don't eat when they're hungry. They don't go to the bathroom when they're need to go to the bathroom. They don't sleep when they need to sleep. They're like, no, I need to be productive, right? It's conditioning to actually ignore the body. Women cannot ignore our bodies. And when we were transitioning, and if you're using hormones, you need to be on a cycle. You need to, have access to medication. When I was pregnant, my white female boss harassed me like crazy because my body was interfering with her corporate agenda, right? As someone who identified as a feminist. And so I think it's not about what your gender is, it's actually about whether your body will cooperate. As soon as a man gets sick, he discovers that he's no longer a cooperative body. It's like menopause makes us not cooperative bodies. So I really agree with your idea that we want to talk about bodies as opposed to gender this way. But I also think it's really important to understand that we're also, I'm sure you all know this, but just to say out loud, we're talking about men's oppression too. This system oppresses everyone. It restricts men as much as it restricts anybody else of any other gender. But it's normalized in such a way that men cannot see it happening most of the time. And so that enculturation has now been spread all over the world. So when we think about, for example, sati, when you brought up sati, I was so like, because like we're going to defend that, and yet, right?
No, I was not defending it, just for the record.
At the time, sati is a better option than living out your life as a young widow, right? Because of how oppressive the conditions for widows have been.
Yeah, we're made to be.
So if you're going to stop sati, which is what the British outlawed sati, then they didn't do anything about the conditions for widows. So it's like, oh, we don't like this makes us uncomfortable, we don't really care about
Yeah, you're begging on the street.
I really want to just bring it back to that. But I was going to think about this question of, right, as soon as you express agency, like I've experienced this in my identify as non-binary. Is that I don't want to identify as fully transitioning to another gender because I'm very rooted in the fact that I gave birth with a womb.
Mhm.
But I don't think that makes me wrong.
Mhm.
And at the same time, I'm constantly masculinized because of my being able to seize my agency.
Yeah.
To the point where, you know, in feminist conversations,
Mhm.
and rightly so, I'm often treated like I'm a man taking up too much space. And I'm trying to be sensitive to that, and at the same time, it's like, you know how hard I have to work to seize this voice, take it, and now you're telling me not to use it.
Yeah.
But that's exactly how I came to identify as non-binary, is because the world will tell you where it thinks you fit on the basis of how cooperative or uncooperative you're going to be. And ultimately, I think for a lot of trans people, I guess perfectly obvious, I think for some people in my community who have shared this with me, that when you transition externally, it's a way of relieving the tension between how you're already perceived internally and externally and what you're told you're supposed to be, which is something.
Yeah, these are all really great points that all of you have made. I hope to hear from more of you that I didn't get to this time, but tomorrow maybe we could have more discussion time. I'll just make one last point. The way Serene wants to define sexism is group by group related. So it's group power, in some cases male power over female power in certain places. But the idea of groups rather than individuals is a really important idea that she's trying to put forward. The way we define those groups is going to be, you know, many different ways, many different variations. We're all members of many multiple groups, and there is absolute oppression of men, and it varies depending on which men, what kind of oppression there is. But she's also wants to define sexist oppression as when there's an imbalance between female power and male power in societies, and that we can define. She wants to say we can identify that, we can judge that as sexist oppression. But we have to begin to think beyond individuals and to think about groups, which opens the question: which groups? How are we going to name them? Which ones are important? And we need to look in our context to see which ones are operating. They may be operating silently, but they're still operating to exclude and to justify violence. Great discussion.
Can I give a book recommendation?
Yeah.
Because Filipinx colleagues over there. My ex-wife wrote a book called The Queer in the Filipino Body.
Oh,
And I think it's a great resource to look at for not just Filipinx folks looking at how feminized labor gets exported abroad, but also how to queer it. And I think it's a great resource for those of us.
great. Yeah.
And Queering the Filipino Body by Gina Velasco.
Okay, go get a break. Get some rest.